Unless you're going for an artistic, creative look, our goal as photographers is to capture sharp, in-focus images. A fundamental aspect of doing so is understanding which focus mode to use in your camera so you can capture your subject with precision and accuracy. If you use the incorrect focus mode for a particular situation, you can be using the wrong tool for the job, like trying to screw in a screw with a hammer. With that being said, in this guide, I'll be covering everything you need to know about focus modes in photography. I'll be covering all the different focus modes in photography, when you should use them, and example scenarios that each focus mode will be best suited for. So let's dive right in. So what are focus modes? In photography, focus modes are a set of settings on your camera that will determine how your camera and lens focus on a subject. As a photographer, you need to know when to use each focus mode and why. For example, having a subject that is not moving versus a subject that is moving will require a different focus mode if you want the best focus. Now, there are only two types of focus modes that you need to know as a photographer: manual focus mode and autofocus mode. Manual focus mode is just what it sounds like. You, the photographer, need to manually adjust the focus on your subject by using the focus ring on your lens. To switch to manual focus, you can switch it to MF on your lens. You adjust the focus by turning your focus ring either clockwise or counterclockwise until your image is sharp and in focus. While manual focus exists, many photographers do not choose this option and instead rely on the numerous autofocus modes provided to us with modern cameras and lenses. So why does it exist then? Well, manual focus is not really the preferred choice for general photography and is really only used in specific situations where your autofocus is struggling. Situations such as if you're photographing in a low light setting like a concert venue or at night, or if you're photographing through obstacles like a fence or a hole, or if you need very precise focus control like in macro photography. Other than that, I recommend always using a specific autofocus mode and taking advantage of the lens and camera technology we have available to us as modern days photographers. And this leads me to my next point, which is the different autofocus modes. The autofocus modes on your camera use internal lens motors and advanced camera technology to focus on your subject. To switch to autofocus, you can switch it to AF on your lens. As I'll cover in the next section, there are various autofocus modes suited for each photography scenario, and knowing what each autofocus mode is and when you should use it is the key to understanding and mastering the focus modes so you can capture any subject during any time of day in sharp focus. So regarding each focus mode, here's the recap. You'll use manual focus mode when autofocus is not cutting it, and it's having trouble working its magic, such as during low light scenarios, or when you need super fine control, like during macro photography. But in general, you want to use an autofocus mode, and this leads me into the next section. Now let's look at each autofocus mode in detail. So what are autofocus modes in photography? Well, as mentioned, setting your camera to a specific autofocus mode means your camera and lens will be doing the focusing for you. But you need to know the different types of autofocus modes and when to use each one. And before we dive in order to access your autofocus modes, you should find a button somewhere on your camera that says AF. I'm using a Canon camera, so if you can't find it on your camera, just do a quick search online for your specific camera. The first autofocus mode we have is single autofocus mode. This autofocus mode is also called one-shot AF on Canon cameras and AFS on Nikon and Sony cameras. Single autofocus is meant for a stationary single subject, as the name suggests. And being a portrait photographer, this is my go-to autofocus mode, as my subjects are always either standing or sitting still in a fixed pose and not moving around much. Single autofocus mode works by locking your focus when the shutter button is hot pressed down. So the technique here is to put your focus point on your main point of emphasis, which will be your subject's eye if you're taking portrait photography, a raindrop on a leaf if you're taking macro photography, etc. Once you put your focus point on this point of emphasis and press the shutter halfway down, then that's when you recompose your shot to the correct composition that you want. In order not to lose your focus point just after one image, many photographers, such as myself, set up back button focus, and this allows us to place the focus point and autofocus, take a shot, recompose, and take another shot, all while holding down this back button down. What this does is, instead of having our shutter button function as the autofocus and the action to actually take a photo, we split up these two actions into separate buttons. The back button will act as the autofocus, and the shutter button will be used solely for snapping the shot. I recommend all photographers set up back button focus, and it's really easy to do. On my Canon 60 Mark II, I set it up by going to the custom functions in my menu, and from there I can change the buttons. If you have a different camera brand, just do a quick search online on how to set it up, how to set up back button focusing for your camera. It'll make your photography focusing and life a lot easier. The second autofocus mode we have is continuous autofocus mode. This autofocus mode is also called AI Servo on Canon cameras and AFC on Nikon and Sony cameras. Continuous autofocus is meant for moving subjects, such as an athlete running on a track, a car driving down a road, a basketball player jumping to the hoop, etc. Continuous autofocus works by the camera continuously adjusting the focus on your subject as long as you keep the autofocus button half pressed. As a portrait photographer, while I mostly use single autofocus mode, there are occasions when I need to use this mode, such as when I want my subject to walk either toward me or perpendicular to me and I want to capture them in a natural pose mid-walk. So for example, in this scenario, I have my subject stand, I place my focus point on them and press my back button focus button to autofocus, then I tell them to start walking, and I start taking photos of them. The camera will keep the focus point on them as they're walking, and I just need to focus on keeping the focus button pressed down while composing my shots. If you're shooting a really dynamic session where the model is moving or dancing, then this mode will also work great as well because it allows you to capture these more fluid, dynamic movements that would be hard to hold in a freeze frame otherwise. And of course, if you're photographing something fast like a bird flying through the sky, a race car on a track, or a football player running down the field, then you'll most likely want to use this autofocus mode. The third autofocus mode is hybrid autofocus mode. This autofocus mode is also called AI Focus AF on Canon cameras and AFA on Nikon and Sony cameras. Hybrid autofocus mode, also known as automatic autofocus, combines single autofocus and continuous autofocus. Hybrid autofocus works by having the camera automatically switch between single and continuous autofocus modes based on the movement of your subject. So if your subject is not moving, it'll use single autofocus, and if your subject is moving, it will use continuous autofocus. Pretty neat, huh? This autofocus mode is a very versatile option and perfect for what I mentioned earlier if you're taking portraits in like a really dynamic session, where your subject's both standing still at one moment and then moving around at another. For example, during some portrait sessions, some models, especially professional ones, like to flow from pose to pose. So this means they're constantly going from a static to a moving subject. And in cases like this, hybrid autofocus mode may be your best choice. Other examples include if you're photographing wildlife or small children and their movements are unpredictable with sudden bursts of action prone to happen at any moment. Other examples include if you're photographing wildlife or if you're a family photographer having to photograph small children in the family and their movements are unpredictable with sudden bursts of action prone to happen at any moment. So which autofocus mode should I use? Well, regarding the autofocus modes, here's the recap. If you have a subject that is not moving, it's best to use single autofocus mode. If you have a subject that is moving, it's best to use continuous autofocus mode. And if you have a subject that is switching between not moving and moving, it's best to use hybrid autofocus mode. Now that we've covered each type of autofocus mode, you must also understand the different autofocus area modes. So what are autofocus area modes in photography? The autofocus area modes determine how your camera uses the autofocus point to lock focus on your subject. So as a recap of everything so far, because I know it can get a little confusing, we first set our focus mode to one of two focus modes, manual focus or an autofocus mode. Now there are three main autofocus modes: single autofocus, continuous autofocus, and a hybrid autofocus. If we chose to use autofocus and selected one of the three autofocus modes, now we must set an autofocus area, which will determine our autofocus points. Before we dive in, I just wanted to note that the following autofocus area modes I'm about to discuss are not on every single camera, depending on what brand you're using. For example, on my Canon camera, I don't have dynamic area AF, but this will be found on most Nikon cameras. So the first autofocus area mode is single point AF. This autofocus area has your camera focus using a single selectable point or area. Single point AF offers the most precision by allowing you to target a specific part for focusing. So this is great for portraits, headshots, macro photography, product photography, or any other scene when you know exactly which part of the image you want in sharp focus. As a portrait photographer, this is my go-to autofocus area mode. By placing this single focus point on my subject's eyes, this will ensure that the subject's eyes are sharp and in focus. Combine this technique with a shallow depth of field, and that's what gets you that beautiful bokeh in your image. The second autofocus area mode is dynamic area AF. This autofocus area mode is available in some cameras like Nikon cameras and allows you to select a primary focus point, and your camera will then use surrounding points to maintain the focus if your subject moves. You can usually select the number of surrounding points such as 9 points, 21 points, and 51 points, allowing you to determine how much camera assistance you need in tracking your moving subject. Dynamic area AF is most suitable if you have a moving subject and you need a buffer zone for the movement. For example, if you're a sports or wildlife photographer, you can use this mode to keep your moving subject in focus. This is because if they momentarily move out of the initially selected focus point, your surrounding points will assist in maintaining the focus. The third autofocus area mode is Group Area AF. This autofocus area mode works by using a group of points selected by you and is often found on Nikon cameras as well. These groups of points will function larger than a single point, but will be more focused than having the entire frame in focus. Group Area AF is great for tracking smaller groups of moving subjects such as athletes or birds in flight, because there will be a reduced chance of your camera focusing on the background or foreground by mistake. The fourth autofocus area mode is Zone AF. This autofocus area mode is often found on Canon cameras, and it's kind of similar to Nikon's dynamic and group area autofocus. Zone AF works by dividing your viewfinder into larger zones, with your camera focusing on your subject within the selected zone. Zone autofocus is great for subjects that are moving within a predictable range, such as a car on a racetrack or athletes on a sports field. In other words, you know the confined area and you're sort of telling your camera, okay, focus within this selected zone. The fifth autofocus area mode is Auto Area AF, or also sometimes called auto selection. This autofocus area mode works by having your camera automatically select the focus points based on your scene. Auto Area AF is best when you're in a fast-paced situation like an event, a wedding, or a party, and you have little time to select a focus point, and your subject is moving unpredictably. Essentially, when you need to quickly capture moments without manually selecting focus points. So unlike the previous autofocus area modes discussed, in Auto Area AF, you're pretty much giving your camera full control to identify and focus on subjects throughout your entire frame. Just note that with this autofocus area mode, your camera will often prioritize the subjects that are closest to your camera, or will try to recognize specific patterns like faces. The sixth autofocus area mode is Face/Eye Detection AF. This autofocus area mode works by your camera automatically detecting human faces or eyes and automatically focusing on them. This autofocus area mode is primarily used for portrait photography, but it has also become increasingly useful in wildlife shots, with some cameras also offering animal eye detection. Now that we've covered the different autofocus area modes, the question remains, which autofocus area mode should I use? The different autofocus area modes can seem a bit confusing, and there's a lot of overlap between them. First, it's important that you look at your own camera and see what autofocus area modes you have available to you. For example, on my Canon 6D Mark II, I have access to Single Point AF, Zone AF, and Auto Area AF. If you have a different camera brand, you may have other autofocus area modes available to you, such as some of the other ones that I mentioned. Now, to better understand which autofocus area mode to use, I wanted to provide a specific scenario, and then look at which autofocus area mode would be best for specific situations. So let's say you're photographing a birthday party. Let's look at when each autofocus area mode would be best given certain scenarios that could happen at the party. So Single Point AF would be best if you're capturing a portrait of the birthday person sitting still, opening gifts, or blowing out candles on a cake, as you can precisely select the focus point on the eyes, ensuring sharp focus. Dynamic Area AF would be best if you're photographing moments such as guests moving predictably, like walking towards the cake, and you need to keep focus on a moving subject with the help of surrounding focus points, compensating for minor movements within the selected area. Group Area AF would be best if there is a group of people gathered for a group photo or engaging in an activity together and they're somewhat spread out, and you need to focus on the group as a whole without the risk of having your camera focus on the background or a single person. Zone AF would be best for a dynamic scene like kids running around, playing a game, or dancing, and you need that larger zone to cover the area of activity so your camera can focus on any subject within the zone. Auto Area AF would be best for when it's getting hectic and you want to capture candid moments quickly, such as people mingling, spontaneous reactions, and surprise moments. Face/Eye Detection AF would be best when you're taking a candid or posed portrait and want to ensure your subject's face or eyes are in sharp focus, such as if they're interacting or posing for your camera. So just remember, for controlled, precise shots like portraits or detailed shots, Single Point AF or Face/Eye Detection AF would offer the accuracy you're looking for. For action and movement shots, Dynamic Area AF is meant for a single subject, Group Area AF is meant for a group, and Zone AF is Canon's version that sort of combines the two for a zone of subjects. For spontaneous, unpredictable moments, Auto Area AF would allow you to focus quickly without manually selecting a focus point. In conclusion, understanding and effectively using the various focus modes available to you is crucial if you want to achieve sharp, well-composed images. The best way I learned focus modes was to understand the various ones as I mentioned in this guide, and then use each one in different scenarios such as with single, stationary, and moving subjects, and then with multiple stationary and moving subjects. This will allow you to see which mode is best for what and when. Thanks for watching.